Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about GDP per capita and its applications. The figure above, 6.1, shows the change in inflation-adjusted GDP per capita for the United States from 1970 to 2018. During this time frame, real GDP per capita rose about 1.8% per year on average. From this graph, we can guess that living standards rose in the United States over the past 50 years, even though growth was not positive in every year. When we discuss increases in standards of living and long-run economic growth, we're concerned with the overall trend in GDP as opposed to the short-run fluctuations. Economic growth, or lack thereof, varies dramatically across countries. Not every country grows by the standard annual 1.8% rate of the United States. The figure on this slide, 6.2, shows the change in GDP per capita for 6 different countries, all with a variety of growth experiences. Next up, we want to take a look at the business cycle. Now, even if a business or an economy is expanding in the long run, it's normal to go through periodic contractions in GDP. Typically, economic growth follows a short run pattern of alternating periods of expansion and contraction that's characterized by changes in employment, productivity, and interest rates that's known as the business cycle. More formally, you can define the business cycle as short run fluctuations around the long run trend. The business cycle has 2 parts. These are expansion and contraction. A complete business cycle will include periods of both expansion and contraction. An expansion is from a trough in GDP to a peak in GDP, which we'll see on the next slide to kind of help you visualize. But during an expansion, total production and total employment increase. A contraction or a recession is from a peak in GDP to a trough. During a contraction, total production and total employment decrease. The idealized business cycle is relatively easy to define, however, in real time, and the phases of the business cycle are often pretty hard to identify. The National Bureau of Economic Research defines a recession as a significant decline in economic activity that's spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months. Normally, this is visible in real GDP, real income, employment, industrial production, and wholesale retail sales. This is animated figure 6.3, and it illustrates the behavior of the business cycle around the long-term trend in real GDP. The straight blue line is going to be our long-run trend of GDP, and it has a positive slope. This indicates that overall we've had economic growth or increases in real GDP over time. Instead of experiencing changes in real GDP exactly along the trend line of long-run real GDP, we actually experience fluctuations in short-run output around the long-run trend. When the level of GDP is higher than usual, the economy climbs to short-run peaks. And when the level of GDP is lower than the trend, the economy falls to short-run troughs. The peaks and troughs divide the business cycle into 2 distinct phases. These are your expansions and contractions. This is figure 6.4 from your book, and it's a plot of US real GDP over time with contractionary periods or official recessions shaded. Real GDP consistently declines in these contractionary periods, and you may recall that a recession began at the end of 2007, which is known as the Great Recession. This is something that we can clearly see in the data. So what does GDP measures? A few questions that you might ask are, why would we count market value? Why include goods and services? Why include only final goods? Why within a country? And why in a particular period? Well, we'll talk about all of those things in the next few slides. So market price is going to be the price per unit multiplied by the quantity produced. Quantities alone don't provide us with enough information, but the units for various quantities cannot necessarily always be added together. Things like gallons of milk, cups of coffee, pounds of steak, bottles of perfume, all of these different things. So in the 2014 year, the United States produced 12 billion bushels of corn and 8 million cars. And this suggests that corn is of more important relevance to GDP in comparison to cars. This is why we start to look at GDP and we measure what's more important to a specific economy. If bushels of corn sell for $5 each, corn would account for $60 billion of GDP. That's the market value, because we take the quantity times that unit price. If each car sells for about 30,000 each, cars would contribute 240 billion to GDP. These numbers are going to tell us a little bit different of a story than just quantities alone. And according to market value, cars actually do account for a larger portion of GDP than corn, even though we sold significantly more corn than we did cars. GDP measures total production, including both goods and services. So goods are things like tangibles, food, clothing, cars, and houses, while services are going to be our intangibles like healthcare, entertainment, advice, travel, and banking. This is figure 6.7, and it shows that over the past 50 years, one big shift has been out of manufacturing goods and more into services. In the past, the dominant industries in the United States were goods like automobiles, steel, and household goods. But now, a majority of US GDP is service output like financial, transportation, retail, and technology. If intermediate goods were counted as part of GDP, they would essentially be counted twice. And that's because intermediate goods are goods that firms repackage or bundle with other goods to be sold at a later stage. This is like milk that we sell to a coffee shop, tires to a car manufacturer, things that are going to be put into something else and then sold again. Their value increases the market value of the final good, and double counting these would bias our measure of GDP upwards. Now, final goods are the goods that we actually sell to final users, and these are things that we include in GDP. And that's things like iPhones that you buy at an Apple store. Only final goods are counted toward GDP to avoid double counting. So here we see the steps, the value added, and then the price of the completed steps. The column on the right is a running total of the numbers to the left, and the final price of the phone altogether is $199. However, if we count all total values of the intermediate steps, we would overvalue that phone and say that it contributed $338 to GDP. This is why we only count final goods. So we'll end this video with a practice what you know. Why doesn't GDP count expenditures on intermediate goods? And the answer here is we want to avoid double counting. That's going to be where we wrap up this video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll talk with you in the next one. Thank you.